The shot that rang out across the dusty main street of Willow Creek silenced every piano in town. But it couldn't quiet the thunder in Hannah Jones's heart as she stood frozen on the boardwalk, watching the aftermath of what would be the last gunfight in the territory that spring of 1878. The stranger who'd called out Sheriff Miller lay face down in the dirt, while Miller himself holstered his smoking Colt with a grim nod to the gathering crowd. Hannah pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, knowing that life in this frontier town would never grant her the peaceful existence she'd once dreamed of back in Boston. Yet something about the wild unpredictability of it all kept her rooted to Wyoming soil like the stubborn sagebrush that dotted the plains. Hannah had arrived in Willow Creek 3 months earlier, a 22-year-old schoolteacher with high hopes and higher collars, determined to bring education to the children of ranchers, miners, and shopkeepers alike. The town had welcomed her readily enough, women being scarce in these parts, but acceptance wasn't the same as belonging. And Hannah found herself perpetually on the outside of the close-knit community that had weathered harsh winters and harsher men together for years before her arrival. As the crowd dispersed and the undertaker's assistants dragged away the dead man, Hannah continued her walk to Finch's general store. She needed lamp oil and perhaps something sweet to lift her spirits. The bell above the door jingled as she entered, and Mr. Finch looked up from his ledger with a smile that crinkled the weathered skin around his eyes. "Afternoon, Miss Jones. How are those youngsters treating you today?" "Well enough, Mr. Finch." Tommy Barker finally learned his multiplication tables, and little Sarah Miller recited her poem without crying. "I'd call that progress." Hannah smiled, browsing the jars of candy while Mr. Finch measured out the lamp oil she requested. "There's to be a social at the town hall Saturday night," Finch mentioned casually. "Celebrating the railroad spur getting approved. Whole town's invited." Hannah nodded politely but felt a familiar tightness in her chest. She'd attended 2 such gatherings since her arrival and spent both evenings seated against the wall, watching others laugh and dance while she remained untouched, unasked, and increasingly invisible. "I'm not certain I'll attend," she said softly. "I have lessons to prepare." "Nonsense," came a new voice from behind her. "All work and no play makes for a dull existence, Miss Jones." Hannah turned to find Mrs. Abigail Porter, the mayor's wife and self-appointed social director of Willow Creek, standing in the doorway with her market basket. Mrs. Porter was a kind woman beneath her forceful exterior, and Hannah suspected she meant well, but her persistent efforts to help Hannah settle in often left the young teacher feeling more conspicuous in her solitude. "The school board doesn't pay you to work yourself to death, Mrs. Porter continued. "You'll attend the social, and that's that. I've arranged for the Jenkins family to bring extra pies, and Thomas Harris is bringing his fiddle all the way from Riverton." "Yes, madam," Hannah replied, knowing resistance was futile. She paid for her purchases and nodded goodbye to both Finch and Mrs. Porter, stepping back onto the boardwalk with a sigh. Saturday arrived with unseasonable warmth, as if spring had decided to rush headlong into summer without pause. Hannah stood before the small mirror in her rented room above the milliner's shop, studying her reflection critically. She'd worn her best dress, a forest green cotton with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs, and pinned her honey-brown hair into a neat arrangement that she hoped appeared fashionable without seeming too eager for attention. The town hall glowed with lantern light when Hannah arrived, and the sounds of laughter and Thomas Harris's fiddle spilled into the evening air. She paused at the entrance, gathering her courage before stepping inside. The hall had been transformed with bunting and wildflowers. Tables laden with food lined one wall, and couples already whirled around the makeshift dance floor at the center. "Miss Jones, you came." Sally Miller, one of Hannah's students, broke away from a group of children playing in the corner to grab her teacher's hand. "Do you like my new dress? Ma made it special." "It's beautiful, Sally," Hannah said, genuinely admiring the child's blue gingham dress with its carefully embroidered collar. "You look like a proper young lady." Sally beamed, then was called away by her friends, leaving Hannah once again alone. She made her way to the refreshment table, accepting a cup of punch from Mrs. Porter, who immediately began introducing her to various townspeople Hannah had yet to meet. Most were polite but distracted, their eyes already searching for more familiar companions as they exchanged pleasantries. As the evening progressed, Hannah found herself in her usual position against the wall, watching as couples formed and reformed on the dance floor. Married folks danced with their spouses. Young men asked blushing girls to join them, and even Mrs. Finch, who must have been 70 if she was a day, was led onto the floor by her husband of 50 years. "No one will dance with me," Hannah whispered to herself, the words barely audible over the music and chatter. She hadn't meant to speak aloud at all, but the painful truth had forced its way past her lips before she could stop it. "That seems unlikely, madam," came a deep voice to her right, startling her so badly she nearly spilled her punch. Hannah turned to find herself looking up quite a way up into the face of a stranger. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with sun-bronzed skin that spoke of long days in the saddle. His dark hair was neatly trimmed, though a bit too long by Eastern standards, and his eyes were a striking shade of blue that reminded Hannah of summer skies. He wore clean but well-worn clothes, a dark shirt, a simple vest, trousers tucked into dusty boots, and a hat that he now held respectfully in his hands. "I beg your pardon," Hannah managed, trying to recall if she'd seen him in town before. "I said it seems unlikely that no one would dance with you." The man's lips curved into a slight smile, "But if that's truly the case, I'd be honored to remedy the situation." He extended his hand. "Zachary Sloan, madam. Most folks call me Zach." Hannah stared at his outstretched hand, momentarily speechless. The fiddle player struck up a new tune and couples began forming on the dance floor once more. "Hannah Jones," she finally replied, placing her cup on a nearby table and hesitantly placing her hand in his. "I'm the school teacher." "I know," Zach said, leading her toward the dance floor. "Word travels fast in small towns. They say you've come all the way from Boston to teach the young'uns of Willow Creek. That's a brave journey for a lady to make alone." As they took their places among the other dancers, Hannah felt dozens of curious eyes upon them. "You're new to town as well," she observed, recognizing the perfect alignment of their outsider status. "Just passing through," Zach confirmed as he placed one hand respectfully at her waist and held her other hand in his. "I'm delivering horses to Fort Laramie, stopped here to resupply." The dance was a simple waltz, and Hannah was grateful for the dancing lessons her mother had insisted upon years ago. Zach moved with surprising grace for such a large man, guiding her through the steps with confidence. "You dance very well for a horse trader, Mr. Sloan," Hannah remarked, finding her voice again as they circled the floor. "My mother would be pleased to hear that," he replied with a chuckle. "She insisted her sons learn proper manners despite our father's objections that it would make us soft. 5 years working cattle drives proved him wrong on that count." "You're a cowboy, then?" Hannah asked, intrigued despite herself. "When the work presents itself. Cowboy, horse trader, occasional guide. A man does what he must out here." His hand was warm and steady at her waist, his eyes never leaving hers as they spoke. When the song ended, Hannah expected him to bow politely and leave her for more interesting company, but instead, he kept hold of her hand. "Another," he asked as the fiddle player began a livelier tune. "I wouldn't want to monopolize your evening," Hannah said, though she made no move to withdraw her hand from his. "Miss Jones, I came to this social for supplies and perhaps a hot meal that I didn't cook myself over a campfire. Finding a beautiful woman to dance with is an unexpected pleasure I have no intention of surrendering." Hannah felt heat rise to her cheeks at his forthright compliment. Before she could formulate a proper response, they were swept up in the pattern of the new dance, separating briefly to circle other dancers before returning to each other. Each time their hands met again, Hannah felt a small thrill course through her. As the evening progressed, Zach Sloan kept his word, claiming Hannah's hand for every dance. They moved together through waltzes and reels, polkas and square dances, stopping only occasionally for refreshments or to catch their breath. During these brief interludes, Hannah learned that Zach was 30 years old, had grown up on a small ranch in Colorado, and had 3 younger brothers who still worked their family land. "What brought you east?" Hannah asked during one such pause, fanning herself with a handkerchief. "East?" Zach laughed. "Madam, most folks would consider Wyoming to be about as west as a man can get without falling into the Pacific. It's all a matter of perspective, I suppose," Hannah admitted with a smile. "From where I stand, Boston is east and everything else is west." "Fair enough. As for what brought me here, opportunity, mostly. The open country, freedom to make my own way." He looked down at her with those piercing blue eyes. "Though I'm beginning to see other attractions to Willow Creek that I hadn't anticipated." Before Hannah could respond to his thinly veiled compliment, Mrs. Porter appeared at her elbow. "Hannah, dear, you've been dancing every dance. I've never seen you so lively." The older woman's eyes sparkled with undisguised interest as she looked between Hannah and Zach. "And Mr. Sloan, how fortunate we are that your business brought you to our little celebration. Will you be staying in town long?" "Just until tomorrow afternoon, madam," Zach replied politely. "I need to get those horses to Fort Laramie by next week." "Such a shame," Mrs. Porter sighed dramatically. "Well, I'll leave you young people to enjoy what time remains." She gave Hannah a significant look before bustling away to oversee the refreshment table. "I believe we've just been approved of," Zach observed with amusement. "Mrs. Porter considers herself responsible for the happiness of everyone in Willow Creek," Hannah explained, "particularly unmarried females." "A noble calling," Zach replied solemnly, though his eyes danced with humor. The fiddle struck up again, and he offered his hand once more. "Shall we disappoint the gossips by sitting this one out?" Hannah looked at his outstretched hand, then back to his face. "I believe I'd rather disappoint them by dancing every dance with the same partner," she said boldly, surprising herself with her forwardness. Zach's smile widened. "Miss Jones, I do believe we understand each other perfectly." And so they danced, song after song, until the musicians packed away their instruments and the townspeople began drifting homeward. Hannah couldn't remember when she'd last enjoyed herself so thoroughly, laughing and talking with this stranger who somehow didn't feel like a stranger at all. As the last of the lanterns were being extinguished, Zach offered to walk Hannah home. The night air had cooled, and Hannah was grateful for the warmth of the shawl she'd brought. They strolled slowly through the quiet streets, their conversation flowing as easily as it had on the dance floor. "Here we are," Hannah said reluctantly as they reached the stairs leading to her rooms above the milliner's shop. "Thank you for the dances, Mr. Sloan, all of them. The pleasure was entirely mine, Miss Jones." Zach stood with his hat in his hands, looking down at her with an expression she couldn't quite read in the moonlight. "I wonder," he began, then stopped. "Yes," Hannah prompted when he didn't continue. I wonder if I might call on you tomorrow before I leave town. Perhaps we could take a walk if the weather holds. Hannah knew she should decline. Proper Boston ladies didn't go walking with men they just met, especially not transient cowboys who'd be gone with the next sunset. But Willow Creek wasn't Boston, and for once, Hannah didn't want to be proper. "I'd like that," she said softly. "I finished teaching at 3 o'clock. Zach's smile was visible even in the dim light. "I'll be here at 3:15. He hesitated, then reached for her hand, raising it briefly to his lips in a gesture that seemed both old-fashioned and thrillingly intimate. "Good night, Miss Jones." "Good night, Mr. Sloan," Hannah replied, her voice barely above a whisper. She watched him walk away down the silent street, his tall figure gradually swallowed by shadows before climbing the stairs to her room. Inside, Hannah moved dreamlike through her evening routine, her mind still filled with the memory of strong hands holding hers, blue eyes that crinkled when he smiled, and the unexpected feeling of belonging she'd experienced in the arms of a stranger. Morning brought reality crashing back as Hannah awoke to the sound of rain beating against her window. The promised walk seemed unlikely now, and Hannah couldn't help but wonder if the rain was a sign that her brief moment of happiness had been just that brief and fleeting, like the sudden spring storms that swept across the Wyoming plains. She dressed for school with care nonetheless, selecting a blue dress that brought out the color of her eyes and arranging her hair more meticulously than usual. If Zach Sloan did call on her despite the weather, she wanted to look her best. The schoolhouse was a simple one-room building at the edge of town, currently filled with 28 children ranging in age from 6 to 16. Usually, Hannah found joy in their eager faces and curious minds, but today she found herself glancing repeatedly at the window, watching raindrops trace patterns down the glass and wondering if the storm would pass by afternoon. "Miss Jones." Tommy Barker's voice pulled her attention back to the classroom. "You've been staring at that same page for an awful long time. Are you feeling poorly?" Hannah blinked, realizing the entire class was watching her with varying degrees of concern and amusement. "I'm quite well, thank you, Tommy. I was just contemplating our next lesson." She straightened her shoulders and returned to the reader with renewed focus. "Now, where were we? Ah, yes, the legend of Sleepy Hollow. Please continue reading from the 3rd paragraph, Mary." By midday, the rain had slowed to a gentle drizzle, and by the time Hannah dismissed her students at 3 o'clock, patches of blue sky were visible between the clouds. She tidied the classroom with unusual haste, her heart beating faster with each passing minute. At precisely 15 minutes past 3, a knock sounded at the schoolhouse door. Hannah smoothed her skirts, took a deep breath, and opened it to find Zach standing on the steps, looking even more handsome in daylight than he had by lamplight. He'd clearly made an effort with his appearance. His shirt was crisp, his vest neatly buttoned, and his boots, while still worn, had been polished. "Good afternoon, Miss Jones," he said, removing his hat. "I see the weather has decided to cooperate with us after all." "It appears so, Mr. Sloan," Hannah replied, pleased that her voice sounded steady despite the fluttering in her stomach. "Shall we?" Zach offered his arm, and Hannah took it, acutely aware of the solid strength beneath her fingertips as they began walking away from the schoolhouse. The town's main street was muddy from the rain, so Zach guided them toward a path that led to a small creek on the outskirts of town. "I hope your pupils weren't too difficult today," Zach said conversationally as they walked. "I imagine 20-some children cooped up during a rainstorm could test the patience of a saint." Hannah laughed. "They were actually quite well behaved. I suspect they were conserving their energy for puddle jumping on the way home." They reached the creek, which had swollen with the rain but remained within its banks. The path alongside it was relatively dry, protected by overhanging cottonwood trees. Yellow wildflowers dotted the grassy areas, their faces turned up to catch the emerging sunlight. "It's beautiful here," Hannah said, breathing in the fresh, rain-washed air. "I don't come this way often enough." "Beauty often goes unnoticed when it's in our own backyard," Zach observed, looking not at the scenery but at her. "Tell me about Boston, Miss Jones. What made you leave it behind for a place like Willow Creek?" Hannah considered the question as they strolled along the creekside path. "I suppose I wanted adventure," she finally said. "My parents died within months of each other when I was 19. After the proper mourning period, I was expected to marry my father's business partner's son, a suitable match that would have secured my future." She paused, remembering the suffocating feeling of being shepherded toward a life others had chosen for her. "But I couldn't do it. I'd been teaching Sunday school for years and discovered I had a talent for it. When I saw the advertisement for a teacher needed in Wyoming territory, it seemed like providence." "That took courage," Zach said softly. "Many would have chosen the safe path." Hannah shrugged. "Perhaps. Or perhaps it was merely selfishness. My aunt certainly thought so." "There's nothing selfish about wanting to determine your own destiny," Zach countered. "That's what drew most of us west the chance to build something of our own making." "And what are you building, Mr. Sloan?" Hannah asked, genuinely curious. "You said you're just passing through delivering horses. Is there somewhere you call home?" Zach was quiet for a moment, his eyes on the creek flowing beside them. "I've been on the move for nearly 5 years now," he admitted. "After my father passed, my brothers and I tried to keep the ranch going, but drought and hard winters took their toll. We sold off most of the land, kept just enough for my mother and brothers to live comfortably. Since then, I've been taking whatever honest work I can find." "That must be a lonely existence," Hannah said gently. "It has its moments," Zach acknowledged, "but there's something to be said for waking up to a new horizon now and then." He glanced down at her. "What about you, Miss Jones? Have you found what you were looking for in Willow Creek?" It was Hannah's turn to fall silent, considering his question honestly. "I've found purpose," she said eventually. "The children need education and I can provide that, but belonging," she shook her head slightly, "that's proven more elusive." "Until last night," Zach said, his voice dropping to a lower register that sent a shiver through Hannah that had nothing to do with the damp air. "Until last night," she agreed softly, meeting his gaze. They had stopped walking, standing now beneath a large cottonwood tree whose branches created a natural canopy. Water droplets occasionally fell from the leaves, creating tiny ripples in the creek beside them. The rest of the world seemed very far away. "Hannah," Zach said, using her given name for the first time, "I'm leaving tomorrow." "I know." She didn't look away from his face, memorizing the lines and planes of it, knowing she might never see it again after tomorrow. "I've known you less than a day," he continued, stepping closer. "By rights, I shouldn't feel this way about a woman I just met." "How do you feel?" Hannah asked, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain he must hear it. Instead of answering with words, Zach closed the remaining distance between them. His hand came up to cup her cheek, his touch infinitely gentle, giving her every opportunity to step away. When she didn't move, he lowered his head and pressed his lips to hers in a kiss that started tender but quickly deepened as Hannah responded, her hands coming up to rest on his chest. When they finally broke apart, both breathing unevenly, Zach rested his forehead against hers. "I feel like a man who's found something he didn't know he was looking for," he murmured. Hannah closed her eyes, savoring the moment while acknowledging its inevitable end. "But you're still leaving tomorrow." "Yes," The word seemed torn from him. He straightened, creating a small space between them, though his hands remained on her waist. Unless, Hannah prompted when he didn't continue. Unless you'd consider coming with me to Fort Laramie, Zach said in a rush. It's a 5-day journey. We'd need a proper chaperone. Of course, perhaps one of the married couples in town would agree to accompany us. From Fort Laramie, you could take the stage back to Willow Creek if you wished. Or... He trailed off, seeming suddenly uncertain. Or, Hannah prompted again, hardly daring to breathe. Or we could see where the trail leads us, Zach finished simply. Together. Hannah stared at him, stunned by the suggestion. You can't be serious, she said finally. We barely know each other. I know that you're brave enough to leave everything familiar behind to chase your dreams, Zach said earnestly. I know that you're patient enough to teach multiplication tables to Tommy Barker, which I'm guessing requires the forbearance of Job himself. This drew a small laugh from Hannah. I know that when you dance, your whole face lights up in a way that makes a man want to keep you smiling forever. He took a deep breath. I'm not asking for promises, Hannah, just a chance. A chance to know you better, to see if what I felt last night, what I'm feeling right now, could grow into something lasting. Hannah's mind raced. What he was suggesting was madness. She had responsibilities, students who depended on her. She couldn't simply abandon them to follow a cowboy she'd met yesterday, no matter how compelling he might be. I can't, she said finally, regret heavy in her voice. My students, the school term ends in 2 weeks, Zach interrupted. You told me so yourself last night. After that, you said most of the children would be helping their families with planting and summer work until harvest is done. It was true. The summer break was approaching, and Hannah had been wondering how she would fill the long, empty days when her teaching duties were temporarily suspended. Even so, she protested weakly, to leave with a man I barely know, what would people think? That's why I suggested a chaperone, Zach reminded her. Everything proper and above board, and if at any point you decide you want to return to Willow Creek, I'll make sure you get back safely. He took her hands in his. Hannah, I'm not asking you to abandon your life here. I'm asking you to consider that there might be more to life than what you've seen so far. Hannah looked into his earnest blue eyes and felt something shift inside her. Wasn't this exactly the kind of adventure she'd been seeking when she left Boston? The chance to determine her own destiny, to experience life beyond the safe and expected path. I would need to speak with the school board, she said slowly. Make arrangements for my absence. Zach's face lit up with cautious hope. Does that mean you're considering it? Hannah took a deep breath, hardly believing what she was about to say. It means I'm saying yes, Mr. Sloan. Yes, I will accompany you to Fort Laramie with proper chaperonage, of course. The smile that spread across Zach's face was like sunrise breaking over the plains. Hannah Jones, you continue to be the most surprising woman I've ever met. He lifted her hands to his lips, pressing fervent kisses to her knuckles. You won't regret this, I promise you. I hope not, Hannah replied with a shaky laugh, because I've either made the bravest decision of my life or the most foolish. Sometimes they're one and the same, Zach said, squeezing her hands gently before releasing them. Now we have arrangements to make if we're to leave tomorrow. Will you allow me to speak to the school board on your behalf? Hannah nodded, still somewhat dazed by her own audacity. We should start with Mrs. Porter. If she approves, the rest of the town will follow her lead. Mrs. Porter it is then, Zach agreed, offering his arm once more. And perhaps she and the mayor might consider being our chaperones. I noticed they seemed quite taken with the idea of us dancing together last night. You noticed correctly, Hannah said with a smile, taking his arm as they turned back toward town. Mrs. Porter has been trying to match me with every eligible bachelor in the county since I arrived. She'll be delighted by this development, if somewhat surprised by its suddenness. As they walked back through Willow Creek, Hannah felt strangely light, as if some invisible burden had been lifted from her shoulders. For the first time since arriving in Wyoming, she wasn't merely existing day to day, but looking forward to tomorrow with genuine anticipation. The next 24 hours passed in a whirlwind of activity. As Hannah had predicted, Mrs. Porter was thrilled by the prospect of chaperoning the journey to Fort Laramie, though she made a great show of concern over the propriety of the arrangement. "It's most irregular," she said, fanning herself vigorously as she sat in Hannah's small sitting room. "A young woman traveling with a man she's just met. In my day, such a thing would have been unthinkable. Which is precisely why Edwin and I will accompany them every step of the way," Mayor Porter reminded his wife placidly. He turned to Hannah with a kind smile. "Miss Jones, in the 3 months you've been with us, you've proven yourself to be a woman of excellent character and judgment. If you believe this journey is worth undertaking, we are happy to facilitate it." "Thank you, Mayor Porter," Hannah said sincerely. "I know it seems sudden, but—" "Say no more, my dear," Mrs. Porter interrupted, her initial reservations apparently forgotten. "When Edwin and I met, he proposed within a week. Sometimes the heart simply knows what it wants." She glanced fondly at her husband of 30 years. "We'll need to pack provisions, of course, and I'll have to speak with Mrs. Finch about caring for my chickens while we're away. And there's the matter of appropriate traveling attire for you. That green dress is lovely for a social but wholly impractical for the trail." As Mrs. Porter continued listing preparations, Hannah caught Zach's eye across the room. He winked at her, and she had to press her lips together to suppress a smile. Somehow, in the space of a day, they had become conspirators, partners in an adventure neither had anticipated. The school board was equally accommodating when approached about Hannah's absence. The timing was fortuitous. With only 2 weeks remaining in the term, they agreed that the older students could assist in teaching the younger ones for the brief period before summer break. Hannah spent the evening preparing detailed lesson plans and writing individual notes to each of her students, explaining her temporary departure and assigning special projects to keep them engaged in her absence. By dawn the next day, a small caravan was assembled at the edge of town. Zach on his sturdy bay gelding, leading 4 prime horses destined for the cavalry at Fort Laramie. Hannah on a gentle mare borrowed from the livery stable, and Mayor and Mrs. Porter in their well-sprung buggy, loaded with provisions for the journey. A small crowd of townspeople had gathered to see them off, including several of Hannah's students who presented her with hastily picked wildflower bouquets. "You'll come back, won't you, Miss Jones?" asked Sally Miller, her small face solemn as she handed Hannah a cluster of prairie daisies. Hannah leaned down from her saddle to accept the flowers. "Of course I will, Sally. I'll be back before you know it, and you can tell me all about the books you've read while I'm away." The child nodded, seemingly satisfied, and stepped back to join her mother. Hannah straightened, adjusting her new riding skirt, a hasty but skillful alteration of one of her everyday dresses, courtesy of Mrs. Porter and the town seamstress. "Ready?" Zach asked, bringing his horse alongside hers. Hannah took one last look at the town that had been her home for the past 3 months, the schoolhouse where she'd taught, the milliner's shop above which she'd lived, the faces of people who had been strangers but were now, if not quite friends, at least familiar parts of her life. Then she turned to Zach, whose blue eyes held promises of horizons she had yet to see. "Ready," she confirmed, and with a nod to Mayor Porter, they set off toward the east, where the rising sun painted the sky in shades of possibility. The first day's travel was easy, following a well-established trail through rolling grasslands dotted with sagebrush and occasional stands of cottonwood trees. The weather held fair, with high clouds tempering the spring sun's warmth. Hannah, who had ridden occasionally but never for such distance, found herself growing stiff as the hours passed, but she refused to complain. She had chosen this adventure, and she was determined to meet its challenges head-on. They stopped at midday beside a small stream to rest the horses and eat a cold lunch of bread, cheese, and dried apple slices that Mrs. Porter distributed from her seemingly bottomless hamper. Zach helped Hannah dismount, his hands lingering at her waist perhaps a moment longer than strictly necessary before he stepped back, mindful of their chaperone's watchful eyes. "How are you faring?" he asked quietly as they walked a little apart from the Porters to stretch their legs. "Well enough," Hannah replied, working to keep the stiffness from her gait. "Though I suspect I'll be feeling today's ride in muscles I didn't know I possessed," Zach chuckled. "It gets easier. By the third day, your body adjusts to the rhythm of the horse." He glanced at her sidelong. "You're doing remarkably well for someone accustomed to schoolroom chairs rather than saddles." "I may be a schoolteacher, Mr. Sloan, but I'm not made of porcelain," Hannah said with mock severity. "I can endure a bit of discomfort in the pursuit of adventure." "So it's adventure you're pursuing?" Zach asked, his tone light but his eyes serious as they met hers. "Not the company." Hannah felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Perhaps a bit of both," she admitted softly. Before Zach could respond, Mrs. Porter called them back for the continuation of their journey. The afternoon passed in companionable conversation as they rode, with Mayor Porter sharing stories of Willow Creek's early days, and Mrs. Porter pointing out various wildflowers and birds along the way. By the time they made camp that evening in a sheltered hollow near a small spring, Hannah was thoroughly exhausted but strangely exhilarated. Zach proved to be an efficient campmaker, quickly establishing a fire pit while Mayor Porter unhitched the horses. Mrs. Porter supervised the arrangement of their sleeping areas, the Porter's tent on one side of the fire, Hannah's smaller one on the other, and Zach's bedroll at a respectable distance from both. After a hearty supper of bacon, beans, and biscuits cooked over the open fire, they sat around the flames, watching as the last light faded from the sky and stars began to appear overhead in greater numbers than Hannah had ever seen in Boston or even Willow Creek. "It's magnificent," she breathed, tilting her head back to take in the vast, glittering expanse above them. "One of the compensations for the hardships of trail life," Zach agreed, his voice equally hushed in the gathering darkness. "No matter how difficult the day, the stars remind a man of his place in the greater scheme of things." Mayor Porter yawned expansively. "Speaking of difficult days, I believe it's time for these old bones to seek their rest. Come, Abigail, let's leave the young people to their star-gazing for a bit." Mrs. Porter looked as if she might object to this breach of chaperone protocol, but another yawn from her husband decided the matter. "Very well, but not too late, mind you. We have another long day tomorrow." She fixed Zach with a stern look that softened as she turned to Hannah. "Good night, my dears." Once the Porters had retired to their tent, Hannah and Zach sat in comfortable silence, the crackling fire between them providing both warmth and a nod to propriety. "Tell me more about your family," Hannah said eventually. "You mentioned brothers," Zach nodded, poking at the fire with a stick. "3 of them. Matthew's the oldest after me, then Luke and John." "Biblical names," Hannah observed. "My mother's influence," Zach confirmed with a smile. She was determined her sons would have names with meaning, even if they did grow up wilder than she might have hoped. He paused, his expression growing more serious. "They're good men, all of them, working hard to make something of what's left of our family land. Do you miss them?" Hannah asked softly. Every day, Zach admitted. But a small ranch can't support 4 grown men and their mother, not without additional income. So I find work where I can and send most of what I earn back to them. Hannah was touched by his obvious devotion to his family. That's very honorable of you. Zach shrugged, seemingly embarrassed by her praise. It's what any man would do for his family. He looked up at her across the fire. What about you? You mentioned your parents passed away, but do you have other family, siblings? No siblings, Hannah said, a familiar sadness washing over her at the thought of her solitary childhood. My mother had several difficult pregnancies before I was born and none afterward. As for other family, there's only my aunt in Philadelphia, my father's sister, who took me in after my parents died. She's a good woman in her way, but we never quite understood each other. And she disapproved of your coming west, Zach guessed. Vehemently, Hannah confirmed with a small smile. She thought I was throwing away my future and ruining my reputation in one fell swoop. According to Aunt Margaret, no respectable man would ever want a wife who had shown such independence of spirit. Your aunt sounds like she's led a very sheltered life, Zach observed dryly. Out here, independence of spirit isn't just admired in a woman, it's essential for survival. Is that so? Hannah asked, warming to the topic. And what other qualities do Western men admire in their women, Mr. Sloan? Zach's eyes met hers across the flames, their blue depths reflecting the firelight. Courage, intelligence, the ability to see beauty in harsh surroundings. He paused, his voice dropping lower. And a smile that makes a man forget his own name when it's directed his way. Hannah felt her breath catch at the intensity in his gaze. You're a flatterer, Mr. Sloan, she said, trying to lighten the moment even as her heart raced. Not in the least, Zach replied seriously. I've never been one for empty words, Hannah. When I say something, I mean it. The sincerity in his voice left Hannah momentarily speechless. How was it possible to feel such a connection to a man she'd known for only 2 days? Yet she couldn't deny the pull between them, the sense that somehow, despite all logic, they understood each other in ways that defied their brief acquaintance. A log shifted in the fire, sending up a shower of sparks that broke the spell of the moment. Hannah glanced toward the porter's tent, suddenly aware of how long they'd been sitting alone together. I should probably retire as well, she said reluctantly. As Mrs. Porter reminded us, tomorrow will be another long day. Zach nodded, rising to his feet in one fluid motion and coming around the fire to help Hannah up. His hand was warm and strong around hers, and he didn't immediately let go once she was standing. Sleep well, Hannah Jones, he said softly, his thumb tracing a gentle circle on the back of her hand. Dream of adventures yet to come. Good night, Zach, Hannah replied, equally quiet. For a breathless moment she thought he might kiss her again, but instead he released her hand and stepped back respectfully. Hannah retreated to her small tent, where she changed into her nightgown with some difficulty in the confined space, before slipping beneath the blankets. Mrs. Porter had insisted on bringing for her comfort. Despite her physical exhaustion, sleep was slow to come as her mind replayed every conversation, every look, every moment of connection she'd shared with Zach Sloan since their first dance. Was she being foolish, following a man she barely knew into an uncertain future? Or was this precisely the kind of bold choice she'd hoped to make when she left Boston behind the chance to write her own story rather than following a path others had laid out for her? With these questions still circling in her mind, Hannah finally drifted into dreams filled with dancing, starlight, and blue eyes that seemed to see straight to her soul. The next 3 days followed a similar pattern. Rising at dawn, traveling through increasingly varied terrain as the flat grasslands gave way to more rugged country, making camp each evening in whatever suitable location they could find. Hannah's riding improved with practice, and the initial stiffness in her muscles gradually eased, just as Zach had predicted. What Hannah hadn't predicted was how much she would come to enjoy the rhythms of trail life, the simple meals that tasted better than any fancy Boston restaurant fare after a day in the saddle, the camaraderie that developed among their small party as they shared the journey's challenges and pleasures, the evenings spent around the campfire sharing stories and songs. Most of all, she hadn't anticipated how naturally Zach would fit into her life, as if a space had always existed for him that she hadn't known was empty until he filled it. They talked of everything and nothing as they rode side by side, books they'd read, places they'd seen, hopes and dreams they'd harbored. Hannah found herself sharing thoughts she'd never voiced aloud to anyone, and Zach listened with an attention that made her feel truly heard for perhaps the first time in her life. On the fourth day of their journey, they encountered their first significant obstacle when heavy rains the previous night had swollen a creek they needed to cross, washing away the simple log bridge that normally spanned it. "We'll have to find another crossing point," Mayor Porter said, surveying the rushing water with concern. "The buggy can't ford this, and I wouldn't want to risk the horses with the current so strong." Zach nodded in agreement. "There should be a wider, shallower crossing about 3 miles upstream. I've used it before when this one was impassable." 3 miles, Mrs. Porter exclaimed, clearly dismayed at the prospect of the detour. "It's our safest option," Zach said firmly. "The water's running too high and fast here." They turned north, following the creek through increasingly wooded terrain. The extra miles added to their journey meant they would reach Fort Laramie a day later than planned, but safety had to take precedence over schedules. By mid-afternoon, they reached the alternate crossing Zach had mentioned, a broad, shallow stretch where the creek spread out over a gravel bed, making it safer to ford. Zach went first, testing the depth and current before signaling the others to follow. Mayor Porter guided the buggy carefully across, the water reaching just below the vehicle's axles at its deepest point. Hannah came next, her mare picking her way confidently through the flow under Zach's watchful eye. "Well done," he said with an approving smile as Hannah reached the far bank. "You handled that crossing like you've been riding the trails for years." "I had an excellent teacher," Hannah replied, pleased by his praise. "You've been very patient with my inexperience." "Some things are worth being patient for," Zach said quietly, his eyes holding hers for a long moment before he turned to check on the Porters, who had successfully brought the buggy across. With the creek behind them, they continued eastward, making camp that evening in a small clearing surrounded by ponderosa pines. The air was cooler here at the slightly higher elevation, and Hannah was grateful for the extra blanket. Mrs. Porter had insisted she take from the buggy as the temperature dropped after sunset. "We should reach Fort Laramie by midday tomorrow," Zach announced as they finished their supper of rabbit stew, courtesy of his hunting skills earlier that afternoon. "I'll need to report to the quartermaster with the horses, but after that, we'll have some time to explore the fort before deciding our next steps." Hannah nodded, aware that a decision point was approaching rapidly. Once they reached Fort Laramie, she would need to choose return to Willow Creek as originally planned, or continue on with Zach to where? They hadn't discussed specific destinations beyond the fort, and Hannah suddenly realized how little concrete planning had gone into this adventure. Later, as they sat by the fire while the Porters prepared for sleep, Hannah voiced her concerns. "What happens after Fort Laramie, Zach? We've talked about everything except what comes next." Zach was quiet for a moment, stirring the embers with a stick. "I've been thinking about that," he finally said. The quartermaster at the fort mentioned in his letter that they might have additional work for me escorting a supply wagon to a new settlement about a week's ride further east. It would be paid work enough to keep us comfortable for a while. Us? Hannah asked, her heart skipping at the casual way he included her in his plans. Zach looked up, his expression earnest in the firelight. If you want there to be in us, Hannah. I told you from the start that I wouldn't hold you to anything. If you decide to return to Willow Creek with the Porters, I'll understand. And if I don't, Hannah's voice was barely above a whisper, if I want to continue this journey, then we'll face whatever comes together, Zach said simply. I can't offer you certainty or luxury, Hannah. The life I lead is often hard and always unpredictable. But I can promise you this: every day would be an adventure, and you would never face it alone. Hannah stared into the flames, weighing his words against the realities of what he was proposing. To continue traveling with him meant embracing a life of constant movement, of never knowing what tomorrow might bring. It meant leaving behind the security of her teaching position, the modest but steady income, the respectable if somewhat lonely existence she'd established in Willow Creek. I need time to think, she said finally. This isn't a decision to make lightly. Of course, Zach agreed immediately. Take all the time you need. Whatever you decide, I'll respect your choice. That night, Hannah lay awake long after the camp had fallen silent, her mind turning over possibilities. The rational part of her insisted that returning to Willow Creek was the only sensible option. She barely knew Zach Sloan. To throw away her secure position for a man she'd met less than a week ago was madness by any standard. Yet another voice whispered that perhaps some decisions weren't meant to be made rationally. In the 5 days since meeting Zach, she'd felt more alive, more herself, than in all the months she'd spent in Willow Creek or the years before in Boston. There was something between them that defied logical explanation, a connection, an understanding, a sense of rightness that made even this uncertain path seem somehow meant to be. Morning came without Hannah having reached a firm decision. As they broke camp and prepared for the final leg of their journey to Fort Laramie, she found herself studying Zach's profile as he saddled his horse, memorizing the determined set of his jaw, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, the gentle way he handled the animals in his care. Fort Laramie appeared on the horizon around noon, its whitewashed walls and parade ground visible from miles away across the open plains. As they approached, Hannah could make out the bustling activity of a major military outpost, soldiers drilling on the parade ground, wagons coming and going through the main gate, laundry flapping on lines behind the officers' quarters. They were met at the gate by a young lieutenant who, upon learning Zach's business, directed them to the quartermaster's office near the stables. Major Williams, a barrel-chested man with an impressive mustache, greeted Zach like an old friend. Sloan, right on time as usual. These must be the horses from the Wilkinson Ranch. He circled the animals appraisingly. Fine stock, just as promised, and I see you've brought company this time. Zach made the introductions, explaining the circumstances of their journey. The major seemed particularly pleased to meet Mayor Porter, engaging him in a discussion of territorial politics, while Mrs. Porter excused herself to freshen up after their long journey. Miss Jones, perhaps you'd like to see more of the fort while the men conduct their business, Mrs. Porter suggested, giving Hannah a significant look that clearly indicated she should accompany her. Once they were alone in the ladies' washroom the major's wife had directed them to, Mrs. Porter turned to Hannah with uncharacteristic seriousness. My dear, we'll be starting back to Willow Creek the day after tomorrow. Edwin has business with the territorial representative who's currently at the fort, so we have a day to rest before the return journey." She paused, studying Hannah's face. "Have you decided whether you'll be returning with us?" Hannah sighed, splashing cool water on her face before answering. "I'm still not certain, Mrs. Porter. My head tells me to return to Willow Creek, to the security of my position and the life I've begun building there. But my heart—" She trailed off, unable to articulate the tumult of emotions Zach Sloan had stirred within her. "Speaks differently," Mrs. Porter finished for her with a knowing smile. "My dear, you think I don't recognize the signs. I may be an old woman now, but I remember what it is to be young and in love." "In love?" Hannah echoed, startled by the older woman's directness. "Mrs. Porter, I've known Mr. Sloan for less than a week. How could I possibly? Time is not always the most reliable measure of such things," Mrs. Porter interrupted gently. "Edwin proposed to me after knowing me for 10 days, and we've had 30 years of happiness together. Sometimes the heart simply knows its match when it finds it." Hannah was silent, considering the older woman's words. Could it really be so simple? Could what she felt for Zach, this connection that seemed to transcend their brief acquaintance, truly be love? "What if I'm wrong?" she whispered, voicing her deepest fear. "What if I follow him and discover that what I thought was love was merely infatuation or the excitement of adventure?" Mrs. Porter patted her hand sympathetically. "That's always the risk, my dear. There are no guarantees in matters of the heart. But ask yourself this: which would you regret more? Taking a chance on something that might be extraordinary, even if it fails, or spending the rest of your life wondering what might have been?" The question stayed with Hannah throughout the afternoon as she and Mrs. Porter toured the fort, visiting the sutler's store where they purchased a few small necessities, and taking tea with the major's wife and several other officers' wives in the commandant's quarters. The ladies were curious about Hannah and her unusual traveling arrangement, but Mrs. Porter skillfully deflected the more intrusive questions, while allowing Hannah to speak for herself about her teaching position in Willow Creek. By evening, arrangements had been made for their accommodation. The Porters were given a guest room in the officers' quarters, while Hannah was offered a small room in the quarters reserved for unmarried female visitors, usually teachers or missionaries, passing through. Zach would bunk with the enlisted men, as was customary for civilian contractors. After a proper dinner in the fort's mess hall, the first meal they'd eaten at a table since leaving Willow Creek, Zach asked Hannah if she would like to walk along the parade ground, which was quiet now that the day's activities had concluded. With Mrs. Porter's approving nod, they set off into the pleasant spring evening, the setting sun casting long shadows across the open space. "Major Williams confirmed there's work for me escorting a supply wagon to the new settlement at Clearwater Creek," Zach said as they walked. "It's good pay and the route is relatively safe, though it would mean another week of travel." Hannah nodded, her thoughts still in turmoil. "When would you leave?" 3 days from now. The supplies are still being assembled." Zach glanced sideways at her. "The Porters mentioned they'll be heading back to Willow Creek tomorrow after the mayor concludes his business." "Yes, Mrs. Porter told me." Hannah stopped walking, turning to face him directly. "Zach, I still don't know what to do. Everything inside me is pulling in 2 different directions." Zach took her hands in his expression solemn in the fading light. "Hannah, listen to me. I meant what I said before. Whatever you decide, I'll respect your choice. If you believe your place is in Willow Creek, teaching those children who clearly adore you, then that's where you should be." "And what about you?" Hannah asked, searching his face. "Where do you believe your place is?" For a long moment, Zach was silent, his blue eyes never leaving hers. A week ago, I would have said my place was wherever the work took me, he finally replied. But now I think my place might be wherever you are. The simple declaration stole Hannah's breath. Zach, let me finish, he said gently. I know this has happened faster than either of us could have imagined. I know it defies logic and conventional wisdom. But Hannah Jones, in the few days I've known you, you've become as essential to me as breathing. I don't want to pressure you or rush you into a decision you might regret. But I would be lying if I didn't tell you that the thought of saying goodbye to you tomorrow makes me feel like I'm losing something precious before I've even fully found it. Tears pricked at Hannah's eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming emotion his words evoked. I feel the same way, she admitted softly. That's what makes this so difficult. I've worked so hard to build a life of my own, to prove to myself and others that I could make my own way in the world. To abandon that for feelings that might be nothing more than a passing fancy, it terrifies me. I understand, Zach said, squeezing her hands gently. And that's why, as much as it would pain me, I would never ask you to give up the life you've built unless you were absolutely certain it was what you wanted. They stood in silence as the last light faded from the sky and stars began to appear overhead, just as they had each night around their campfire. Hannah thought of the journey they'd shared, of the easy companionship that had developed between them, of the way Zach listened when she spoke as if her thoughts and feelings mattered deeply to him. She thought of Willow Creek, of her students' faces, of the small room above the milliner's shop where she'd begun to build a life. It was a good life, a respectable life, the kind of life her parents would have approved of. But was it the life she truly wanted? I don't have to decide tonight, do I? She asked finally, her voice small in the gathering darkness. No, Zach assured her. You have until the Porters leave tomorrow afternoon. Take the night to think, to pray if that's your way. Whatever you decide, Hannah, know this meeting you has changed me in ways I'm only beginning to understand. For that alone, I will always be grateful. He raised her hands to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles before releasing them. It's getting late. I should escort you back to your quarters. They walked in silence back to the building where Hannah would spend the night, the weight of the impending decision heavy between them. At the door, Zach bowed formally, the gesture at odds with the emotion evident in his eyes. Good night, Hannah. Sleep well. Good night, Zach, she replied, watching as he turned and walked away across the parade ground, his tall figure gradually swallowed by the darkness just as it had been that first night in Willow Creek. Inside her small room, Hannah prepared for bed mechanically, her mind still churning with thoughts and emotions. Sleep seemed impossible, yet exhaustion eventually claimed her, carrying her into dreams filled with crossroads and choices, none of which led to clear destinations. She awoke at dawn, no closer to a decision than she had been the night before. After dressing and arranging her hair, she made her way to the mess hall, where she found the Porters already at breakfast. Of Zach there was no sign. He's with the quartermaster, Mayor Porter explained, noting her searching glance around the room. Something about paperwork for the horses and the upcoming supply run. Hannah nodded, accepting a cup of coffee from a passing orderly with a murmured thanks. Have you concluded your business with the territorial representative, Mayor Porter? Indeed I have, the older man confirmed. Most satisfactory discussion. We'll be ready to depart for Willow Creek by mid-afternoon, assuming you've made your decision by then. Edwin, Mrs. Porter chided gently. Give the girl some peace. These matters of the heart can't be rushed. Hannah smiled gratefully at the older woman, though her stomach nodded at the reminder of the choice that loomed before her. After breakfast, she excused herself to walk around the fort, hoping that movement might clear her thoughts. The day was bright and clear, with a gentle breeze that carried the scent of sage and distant mountains. Hannah found herself drawn to the eastern gate of the fort, where she stood looking out across the vast expanse of prairie that stretched toward the horizon. Somewhere out there lay Clearwater Creek, the settlement Zach had mentioned, a place she'd never seen, filled with people she'd never met. The unknown. Behind her lay the road back to Willow Creek, to her students, her small but comfortable room, the life she'd begun building. The familiar, Miss Jones. Hannah turned to find Major Williams approaching, his mustache neatly waxed and his uniform immaculate despite the early hour. "Good morning, Major," she greeted him politely. "It's a beautiful day, isn't it?" "Indeed it is, madam," he agreed, coming to stand beside her at the gate. "Finest kind of spring day, makes a man glad to be alive in this country." He glanced at her sidelong. "I understand you have a decision to make today." Hannah blinked in surprise. "News travels quickly, it seems." The Major chuckled. "Small community, the fort. Not much happens that everyone doesn't know about by breakfast." His expression grew more serious. "If you'll permit an observation from a man who's seen a fair bit of life, Miss Jones." "Of course," Hannah replied, curious despite herself. "I've known Zachary Sloan for going on 3 years now," Williams said, looking out across the prairie rather than at Hannah. "Done business with him regularly, horses, supply runs, scouting when we needed someone who knows the territory. He's one of the most honest, reliable men I've ever met." He paused, tugging thoughtfully at his mustache. "Also one of the loneliest, though he'd never admit it." Hannah remained silent, absorbing this unexpected perspective on the man who had so thoroughly upended her carefully ordered life. "Until yesterday," the Major continued, "I'd never seen Sloan look at anything or anyone the way he looks at you, Miss Jones. Like a man who's found something he'd stopped believing existed." He turned to face her directly. "I don't mean to presume, and I certainly wouldn't want to influence a decision that's rightly yours alone to make, but I thought perhaps the observation might be of some value to you." "Thank you, Major," Hannah said softly, touched by the gruff officer's unexpected insight. "It does help in its way." Williams nodded briskly, as if embarrassed by his foray into matters of the heart. "Well then, I'll leave you to your contemplations. Good day, Miss Jones." As the Major strode away across the parade ground, Hannah remained at the gate, his words echoing in her mind. "One of the loneliest men I've ever met. A man who's found something he'd stopped believing existed." She thought of Zach's life as he described it, constantly moving from job to job, place to place, with no real home beyond the family ranch he visited only occasionally. She thought of her own loneliness in Willow Creek, surrounded by people yet never truly belonging. Two solitary souls who had somehow found connection in the most unexpected of circumstances. Was that enough to build a future on? Could feelings that had developed so quickly truly be trusted? Or was she simply caught up in the romance of adventure, the novelty of a handsome cowboy who looked at her as if she were something precious? Lost in these thoughts, Hannah barely noticed the passing of time until the noon bell rang from the fort's central tower. She started, realizing she'd been standing at the gate for hours, and yet she was still no closer to a decision. As she turned to head back toward the center of the fort, a familiar figure appeared in the distance, walking toward her with the easy, ground-covering stride she'd come to know so well. Zach. Her heart quickened at the sight of him, a reaction she could neither control nor deny. He stopped a few paces away, hat in hand, the breeze ruffling his dark hair. "I've been looking for you," he said simply. "I needed to think," Hannah replied, gesturing vaguely toward the open prairie beyond the gate. Zach nodded in understanding. "And have your thoughts led you to a decision?" Hannah shook her head, frustration evident in the gesture. I keep going in circles. Every time I think I know what I should do, I question myself again. Perhaps you're approaching it from the wrong direction, Zach suggested gently. Instead of thinking about what you should do, ask yourself what you want to do. If there were no expectations, no obligations, no concerns about propriety or security, what would your heart choose? The question struck Hannah with unexpected force. What did she want, truly want, beyond the expectations that had shaped her choices for so long? She closed her eyes, letting go of should and ought and sensible for just a moment, and listened to the quiet voice within that had been trying to make itself heard all along. When she opened her eyes again, Zach was watching her with that patient, attentive gaze that made her feel truly seen. "I want to go with you," she said, the words coming out in a rush before doubt could silence them. "I want to see Clearwater Creek and whatever lies beyond it. I want to know if what I feel for you is real and lasting, and I'll never know that if I go back to Willow Creek tomorrow and spend the rest of my life wondering what might have been." The smile that spread across Zach's face was like sunrise breaking over the plains. "Are you certain, Hannah?" "Truly certain. Because once we leave here, I'm certain," Hannah interrupted, her voice stronger now, conviction growing with each word. "I can always go back to teaching if we don't work out, but I can't go back and reclaim this chance once it's gone." Zach closed the distance between them in 2 long strides, taking her hands in his. "Hannah Jones, you continue to be the most surprising woman I've ever met." "Is that a good thing?" she asked, suddenly shy despite her bold declaration. "The very best thing," Zach assured her, his blue eyes alight with joy and something deeper that made Hannah's breath catch. "I promise you won't regret this. Whatever comes, we'll face it together." For the first time since waking that morning, Hannah felt the tension leave her shoulders, replaced by a sense of rightness that defied logical explanation. She had made her choice, not the safe choice or the sensible choice, perhaps, but the one that felt true to the woman she was becoming. The Porters took the news of Hannah's decision with mixed reactions: concern from the mayor, barely concealed delight from Mrs. Porter, who embraced Hannah warmly and whispered, "Follow your heart, my dear. It rarely leads us astray." Arrangements were made swiftly. Hannah would accompany Zach on the supply run to Clearwater Creek, properly chaperoned by the missionary couple who were also traveling with the wagon. Beyond that, the future remained unwritten, a blank page waiting for them to fill it together. As she stood with Zach at the fort's western gate, watching the Porter's buggy grow smaller in the distance as they began their journey back to Willow Creek, Hannah felt a curious mixture of trepidation and exhilaration. She had chosen the unknown over the familiar, possibility over certainty. "Having second thoughts?" Zach asked softly, noting her pensive expression. Hannah turned to him, the man who had asked her to dance when no one else would, who had seen something in her that others had missed, who had offered her not just his hand but a chance at a different kind of life. "Not a single one," she replied, and knew it for the truth. The journey to Clearwater Creek was both more challenging and more rewarding than Hannah could have imagined. The supply wagon moved slower than they had on horseback, and the trail was rougher in places. But the extra time allowed Hannah and Zach to deepen their understanding of each other in ways that might have taken months under more conventional circumstances. They talked for hours as they rode side by side, sharing stories of their childhoods, their hopes and dreams, their views on everything from politics to poetry. They discovered shared values: honesty, loyalty, a belief in the fundamental goodness of people, despite evidence to the contrary, and differences that complemented rather than divided them. Hannah's thoughtful nature balanced Zach's more impulsive one. His practical experience of the world tempered her idealism without diminishing it. The missionary couple, Reverend and Mrs. Fletcher, proved to be excellent traveling companions and discreet chaperones, giving Hannah and Zach space to build their relationship while maintaining the proprieties that both still valued despite their unconventional situation. By the time they reached Clearwater Creek, a small but growing settlement nestled in a valley between rolling hills, Hannah had no doubts about her decision to continue this journey with Zach. What had begun as an impulsive adventure had evolved into something deep and lasting, a partnership that felt more right with each passing day. The settlement welcomed them warmly, especially once it became known that Hannah was a trained teacher. The community leaders immediately approached her about establishing a school, offering a small cabin and a modest salary if she would stay and educate their children. "It seems you're in demand wherever we go," Zach observed with a smile as they discussed the offer over supper in the settlement's only restaurant. "What do you think? Is Clearwater Creek a place you could see yourself staying for a while?" Hannah considered the question seriously. The settlement was larger than Willow Creek, with nearly 100 families and growing, thanks to rich farmland and a newly discovered silver deposit in the nearby hills. It had a proper church, a doctor, several thriving businesses, and now the possibility of a school, all the makings of a stable community. "I could be happy here," she said thoughtfully. "The people seem kind, and there's certainly a need for education." She looked up at Zach, the question in her eyes that she was still too uncertain to voice aloud. Would he stay too, or was Clearwater Creek simply another temporary stop on his perpetual journey? Zach reached across the table to take her hand, seeming to read her unspoken concern. "As it happens, the settlement's looking for someone to break and train horses for the new stage line they're planning. It would be steady work, at least through the summer and fall." Hope blossomed in Hannah's chest. "You're considering staying?" "I'm considering many things," Zach replied, his expression growing more serious, "including the fact that I've spent 5 years wandering from job to job, place to place, without ever feeling like I belonged anywhere, until now." Hannah's breath caught at the implication of his words. "And now?" "Now I'm beginning to think that belonging isn't about a place at all," Zach said softly. "It's about a person. About finding someone who sees you clearly and accepts you completely, who challenges you to be better than you are while loving you exactly as you are." Tears pricked at Hannah's eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming emotion his words evoked. "Zach, Hannah Jones," he interrupted gently, taking both her hands in his across the table. "I know we've known each other for less than 3 weeks. I know that by any conventional standard, what I'm about to ask is madness. But I've never been much for convention, and I'm hoping that you aren't either, not when it really matters." Hannah's heart pounded so loudly she was certain everyone in the small restaurant must hear it. "What are you asking?" she whispered, though she already knew, had perhaps known since that first dance in Willow Creek. "I'm asking if you would do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife," Zach said, his blue eyes never leaving hers. "Not because it's proper or expected or convenient, but because I love you, Hannah. I love your courage and your intelligence, your kindness and your determination. I love the way you see beauty in places others might miss it, the way you never give less than your best to anything you undertake. I love the person I am when I'm with you, and the person I believe we could be together." Tears spilled freely down Hannah's cheeks now, but she made no move to wipe them away, her hands still clasped tightly in Zach's. "I love you too," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "I think I've loved you since you asked me to dance when no one else would, since you looked at me and really saw me, Not just the quiet schoolteacher from Boston, but the woman I am beneath all the expectations and proprieties. Is that a yes? Zach asked, hope lighting his features. Hannah laughed through her tears. Yes, Zachary Sloan. Yes, I will marry you, convention be damned. Zach's answering smile was radiant as he rose from his seat, still holding her hands, and drew her to her feet. Right there in the middle of Clearwater Creek's only restaurant, surrounded by curious onlookers, he kissed her with a tenderness that spoke volumes about the kind of husband he would be: passionate yet gentle, strong yet considerate, completely devoted to her happiness. When they finally broke apart, breathless and laughing, the restaurant erupted in applause and cheers, led by the proprietor, who immediately declared their meal on the house, in celebration of their engagement. They were married 2 weeks later in Clearwater Creek's small church, with Reverend Fletcher officiating, and the entire settlement turning out to witness the union of their new schoolteacher and horse trainer. Hannah wore a simple white dress sewn by the women of the community, who had taken her under their wing with enthusiasm once they learned of the engagement. Zach, resplendent in a new shirt and vest, his boots polished to a shine, waited for her at the altar with an expression of such joy and love that Hannah felt her heart might burst from happiness. Their vows were traditional but deeply felt, each word a promise they intended to keep through whatever life might bring them. When Reverend Fletcher pronounced them husband and wife, Zach's kiss was both a seal on their covenant and a promise of the life they would build together, a life of love, partnership, and adventures yet to come. The celebration afterward lasted well into the night, with music and dancing, food and laughter, the community embracing the newlyweds as their own. As the evening progressed, Hannah found herself once again in Zach's arms, dancing beneath the stars just as they had that first night in Willow Creek. "Happy Mrs. Sloan," Zach murmured, holding her close as they swayed to the music. "Happier than I ever imagined possible," Hannah replied, resting her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "Thank you for asking me to dance that night. Thank you for seeing me when I felt invisible." "I will always see you, Hannah," Zach promised, pressing a kiss to her hair. "And I will always ask you to dance every chance I get for all the days of our lives." "I'm going to hold you to that, Cowboy," Hannah said with a smile, lifting her face to his for another kiss. As the years passed, Zach kept his promise. Through the growth of Clearwater Creek from settlement to proper town, through the building of their own home on a small piece of land at the edge of town, through the birth of their children, first a daughter with her father's blue eyes and her mother's determination, then twin boys who grew into young men as steadfast and honorable as their father, Zach never missed an opportunity to take Hannah's hand and lead her into a dance, whether at formal gatherings or in the privacy of their kitchen. Hannah flourished as both teacher and wife, establishing a school that grew from a single room to a proper building with multiple classrooms as Clearwater Creek prospered. Zach's work with horses expanded from training for the stage line to breeding and raising his own stock, developing a reputation throughout the territory for quality and fair dealing. They faced challenges, of course, harsh winters, economic downturns, the inevitable conflicts that arise between two strong-willed individuals building a life together. But they faced each obstacle as they had from the beginning, hand in hand, partners in all things, their love deepening and strengthening with each passing year. On their 25th wedding anniversary, the town of Clearwater Creek held a celebration in their honor, recognizing not just their marriage but their contributions to the community they had helped build. As the music started and other couples took to the dance floor, Zach turned to Hannah, his hair now silver at the temples but his blue eyes as bright and loving as ever. "No one will dance with me," Hannah said with a mischievous smile, echoing the words she had whispered so long ago in a different town, at a different dance. Zach's answering smile was tender as he rose and extended his hand to her, just as he had that first night. "That seems unlikely, madam," he replied, following the script that had begun their story. "But if that's truly the case, I'd be honored to remedy the situation." As he led her onto the dance floor, their children and grandchildren watching with knowing smiles, Hannah marveled at the journey that had brought them to this moment, from strangers to lovers to partners in a life richer and more fulfilling than either could have imagined alone. "Still happy, Mrs. Sloan?" Zach asked softly as they moved together in perfect harmony, the steps of their dance as familiar as breathing after 25 years. Hannah looked up at the man who had changed her life with a simple invitation to dance, who had offered her not just his hand but his heart, who had loved her faithfully through every joy and sorrow their shared life had brought. "Happier with each passing day," she replied truthfully. "And grateful, every single day, that I found the courage to say yes to the handsome cowboy who asked me to dance." "Best decision you ever made," Zach teased, his eyes crinkling at the corners in the way that still made her heart skip even after all these years. "Best decision we ever made," Hannah corrected gently. "To take a chance on each other, to build something lasting from a beginning that anyone else might have dismissed as merely a romantic whim." "Never a whim," Zach said, his expression growing serious. "From the moment I saw you standing alone against that wall, something in me recognized something in you. Like my heart had been waiting for yours without me even knowing it." "I know exactly what you mean," Hannah replied softly. "It felt like coming home, even though we were both far from anywhere we'd ever called home before." "You are my home, Hannah," Zach said simply. "You always have been from that very first dance." As the music continued around them, Hannah rested her head against her husband's chest, listening to the steady, familiar beat of his heart. 25 years ago, she had made a choice that defied convention and caution, following her heart rather than her head. It had been the first step on a journey that had brought her more joy, more love, more life than she could ever have imagined possible. And it had all begun with those 7 simple words spoken in a moment of loneliness and heard by the one person meant to hear them. "No one will dance with me," a woman said, and a cowboy took her hand for every song.